So there we are. Okay, perfect. So we can get into it now. So again, want to welcome everybody for joining tonight. I want to thank you for your patience and apologize again for the issue last week. We've gotten to the bottom of it, and here we are. We've got Jim Macnamara to present to you on the topic of the media's construction of male identity. And as I said earlier, this is a resumption of our webinar series. This is the first of many to come. I've just been talking a little bit about some of the upcoming events. If you're not on our email list, you can get in touch with me, info@menandfamilies.org, and ask to get those updates, and then you'll know what's coming up. Tonight, we're going to be here with Jim for about an hour and a half. So the presentation will be about 45 minutes. We'll then have question and answers for about 20-25 minutes. We'll see what we have from people in the audience and see how long Jim's willing to go with us there. I'll also ask you, as I've done in the past, if you don't want your name to be publicized, some people aren't comfortable with that, before you put your hand up to ask a question, you can take your name or change your name in the Zoom webinar so that it doesn't show up, or use your initials, whatever you like. And you can't raise your hand. That's a function that Zoom webinar provides. So we'll ask you to use that to raise your hand if you do have a question. As I said earlier, we're live streaming this, so just keep that in mind. It will be recorded. Well, it's currently live streaming, but it also will live on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, Equality Canada TV, youtube.com/Equality Canada TV, if you want to see what we have there. As I usually do, I like to remind folks that we do have a number of online, actually many online programs and services, which have been increasing in sort of popularity during the pandemic. A lot of people taking advantage of these, mostly mental health and social services, but the full list is on menandfamilies.org/online programs. So if you or your family can benefit from any of those supports, that's why we're here. So please take advantage of that. Okay, so let me get into today's presentation with Jim Macnamara. Let me tell you a little bit about Jim. He is Distinguished Professor in the School of Communication at the University of Technology, Sydney, and also currently serving as Deputy Dean of the UTS Faculty of Science. He's the author of the groundbreaking book, Media and Male Identity, The Making and Remaking of Men. He's also completed an extensive media content analysis of representations of men in 2006, and since then has conducted a number of research studies in relation to health communication, which is his primary area of focus these days, most recently completing a study for the World Health Organization during COVID-19. So he's going to be talking today primarily about men in the media, but I've also asked him, given we're living through a pandemic and his participation in health communication, to comment a little bit in that area as well. So I think we're going to have an exciting event, a very diverse event with Jim Macnamara, who I'm going to turn things over to now. Take it away, Jim.
Thank you, Justin. It's a pleasure to be with you. And as was said, I'll be talking about research I've done initially into the representations of men in the media. The book is written a few years ago, so I will also talk about some of the more recent research I've done in health communication as well. Just by way of introduction, and why would we look at mass media? Well, of course, media is a primary site of discourse in contemporary societies. Media both create and reflect opinion, so it's important to not always assume that they are creating public opinion, but they both create, and if they're not creating, they're also reflecting what is out there and what people are saying. And so in simple terms, the basis of the book I wrote was that media make an imprint on us all in some way. And that's depicted in the photograph you see, which is on the cover of the book, that I give credit to a very well-known photographer who specializes in disabilities and diversified groups, Belinda Mason. My vantage point, just quickly to summarize it, is I came at this research after working in journalism, in public relations and media research for almost 3 decades. And that included 11 years as the CEO of a global media analysis firm. So I'd been observing media for a long, long time. My background is I have a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism and Media Studies, a Master's of Arts by Research, where I looked at impact of public relations on media, did a PhD in 2002, 2005 that actually did look at portrayals of men and male identity. That was triggered at the time. I had a teenage son who was asking me lots of questions about why at school the boys were being, in his words, picked on, why they were told to behave more like the girls, why male behavior such as running around and kicking footballs was suddenly not considered an appropriate activity. And I had a very confused son, and that sort of encouraged me to take my expertise and interest in media and have a look at men and male identity. Since 2007, as was introduced, I've been a professor in public communication at the University of Technology, Sydney. So I spent most of my life with media. This research, even though it was a few years ago, I'll talk about current situations, and I think some of the issues are still current, but it was a very in-depth quantitative and qualitative content analysis of a very large sample of media content. So I looked at in detail more than 2,000 newspaper and magazine articles and TV program segments over a period of 12 months. And in particular, I focused on news, current affairs, and lifestyle programs rather than entertainment. And I know it's important to look at entertainment because that has soap opera, for example, has an effect. But I was particularly interested to look at media that allegedly present reality, the media that so-called report the facts rather than fiction, because I thought that hadn't been done very well. And that was even more important because they were allegedly presenting us with factual and accurate and balanced views of society. It was quite a rigorous methodology, as well as having a very large sample. I used multiple coders, including women coders who work with me, and we did intercoder reliability testing. So the conclusions that I'll show you some of were not just my conclusions. There was at most stages 3 researchers actually looking at the analysis, looking at the data independently. What did I find? Well, I'll run through a number of the key findings. Almost 70% of all mentions or portrayals of men in the media at that time were unfavorable, and I'll break that down in a moment. So only 12% of media coverage was assessed as being positive or favorable to men. In the media, it's common to, it was certainly then, and still somewhat is, to denigrate, marginalize, and laugh at men. So there were lots of cartoons, and we looked at text as well as visual images. There's also objectification of men, particularly at that time. Some of you, if you're old enough, may recall that the metrosexuals was a popular term at the time. Man bags, and men were sort of suddenly presented as sex objects in the way that women had objected to for quite some time. Some of those things could be regarded as lighthearted, and in fact, we do have to recognize that some of this is humor and satire. However, the coders in this case concluded that there were serious underlying messages. And when you show a cartoon like the image on the left, it's certainly saying something fairly derogatory about men and male identity. So what were some of the profiles of men? Well, men were portrayed overwhelmingly, and you can see it on the chart here. And I might just minimize my camera to avoid overlaying slides at the moment. But we looked at all of the coverage and found that men as villains in an offence or a crime, men as aggressors such as domestic violence, men as perverts, and men as philanderers, particularly deadbeat dads and not taking care of children and spouses, they were the dominant portrayals of men. With being a good father or being a hero or being a protector or being a husband, partner, etc., were much less reported. Now, the columns are volume, and the line you see running through the charts is a rating of what's called favorability. You could call it positivity, but it's a rating on a scale of 0 to 100. So you can see men as heroes and good fathers is very highly favorable, but it's fairly low in volume. The main issue in all of those portrayals was violence and aggression. So we then broke that down further. Violence and aggression, the key topic of other key topics were fatherhood and family, male sexuality, and work and career. You'll see that violence and aggression is overwhelmingly the most reported issue in relation to men. Fatherhood and family identity and family role was about neutral. So it was interesting that it was neither positive nor negative. It was sort of balanced. Male sexuality was very negatively portrayed. Masculinity was seen as a highly negative condition to suffer from. Work and career was also slightly unfavorable. It's really not till you get to commitment and responsibility that you see something, a coverage creeping above the 50% mark in terms of favorability. In terms of violent crime, we broke that down even further. So violent crimes followed by sexual abuse, crime generally, such as burglaries. Domestic violence was relatively low in reporting at that time. And interestingly, I can't speak for Canada, but certainly in the US, the UK, and Australia, reporting of male domestic violence has increased quite substantially. And it's an interesting topic because domestic violence is almost always in the media associated with men. It is very, very rare to read or hear or see domestic violence perpetrated by women. The interesting here, this is a chart that I found particularly important. We broke it down to what was the main message in each of these media reports. And these are the top 10 messages. And this chart, probably more than any, shows the overall picture of highly negative messages. The most times men were mentioned in the media was as criminals. Secondly, as aggressive, violent, sexual abusers or predators. Commitment orientated and responsible was a very highly positive message, hence it's shown in the green going to the right. But chauvinists, oppressors, misogynists, stupid, incompetent, insensitive, out of touch with their feelings. So you can see there that 7 of the top 10 messages that were prominent in media were quite negative, and only 3 of the leading messages were showing men in a positive light. Male sexuality was rather demonized in the sense that the leading sexual issue was pedophilia. Homosexuality was reported, but mainly in terms at that stage of stereotypes. That is one issue that has actually improved in media portrayals in recent years, where there is much greater acceptance with things like gay marriage and much more normalizing of sexuality of various kinds. There was criticism of heterosexuality. Very often, heterosexuality in men was seen as macho, associated with macho behavior and boorish behavior. Male social behavior also was fairly negative in the media. That was a time when the term metrosexuals became very popular. But if you weren't a metrosexual, you're a chauvinist, or what the English would call blokiness, was very, very prominent in the media. And so metrosexuals you see as the highest volume at that time. Family man was reported a lot, and it is significant, and it was quite positive, as you see. Men as a gentleman was also, and these weren't always the exact words that were used, but it would, the coders used a series of close synonyms. So if it used, in the case of metrosexuals, it was metrosexuals, men showing their feminine side. In the case of gentlemen, it was words such as dignity were associated with gentlemanness. Fatherhood was a particularly interesting one to me, and this was, we found that there was certainly growing recognition. This was a time, 2005, 2006, where there was a lot of recognition starting to occur of the importance of fathers in a family relationship. The problem was that at the same time, there was widespread criticism of the lack of father involvement. In many countries, there was reforms going through family courts, issues of child custody and access, and common reporting of deadbeat dads. In fact, I think the phrase deadbeat dads was specifically used in 20 or so articles, very, very negatively. But so you see here in this chart, the role of father involvement overall was recognized, high in volume, but child custody was a major issue, usually very vexed. Discussions of the family court or equivalents in other countries was fairly negative towards men. It was usually men not getting access to children, men not paying child support, linked to deadbeat dads, some reporting of single lone parent families, and that was generally reported as in a deficit tone, rather than someone doing a very good job as a single parent. as I said, deadbeat dads, paternity leave, and so forth. So men, in terms of the role of fatherhood, overall was, yes, we recognize the importance of fathers, but there were not that many positive, much positive reporting of their role as fathers. Work was also portrayed quite negatively because certainly at this time, and I think COVID has dramatically changed things to a large extent with people working at home, more flexibility coming into the workplace. Many say it's a change that should have come without COVID. But there's certainly, prior to COVID, there's been an over-focus on career, either by choice or the nature of our industrial age. Work and family imbalance, the boys' club at work, discrimination against women at work. So you see in the chart that success being assessed in terms of a career was most commonly reported, but not all that positively, often barely positive on the scale of 0 to 100. Family and work lifestyle balance was mostly unfavorable or at best neutral. The boys' club at work and discrimination against women was a very unfavorable topic in the media. Inequality in pay and earnings, and so on down the line. I think promotion and achievement was one of the few things that made it up as a positive story. Male health, I'm sure you'll be interested in. Also at this time was very negatively reported, and mostly it was seen as men's own fault. Excessive alcohol and drinking was the most reported issue, very, very prominent in the media and very unfavorable. Drug abuse, disease generally, preventative medicine, prostate cancer in particular was a topic discussed at the time. And so it was generally seen that men were subject to health issues, but largely because of their own inattention, their own lifestyles, and so forth. And there was not much focus on support networks around those issues. Just as another more general aside, we found it interesting in doing the coding that at the time around the world, there was a lot of work being done to eliminate gendered language. And particularly gendered language against women. But interestingly, in all of the crime reporting, we saw the term manhunts, gunman. It was never a person with a gun, it was always a gunman, if it were a con man. And the discussion of the environment and climate change was starting to gather momentum at this time. And we always referred to, sometimes used the term the Anthropocene, but very often environmental threats were described as man-made. They were never associated with humans. The term man-made climate change was used quite extensively. And we thought that was an interesting double standard, that we were working actively in language and in universities to stamp out gendered terms related to women. But media certainly continued to use gendered language in relation to man. A disturbing factor, and this is one of the issues my son raised when he was a young teenager, is that when men were reported positively and seen as having positive traits, they were discussed as men exhibiting their feminine side. And this was considered to be a good thing. And yet it's quite interesting that what that suggests is that the only good in men is when they have feminine characteristics or female characteristics. And that, of course, there was a matter of concern to boys growing up, because boyish behavior that is considered quite normal by many psychologists was seen as a highly negative side of behavior, and boys were being encouraged to act more like the girls. I found this very interesting, that we also looked at the bylines of all the writers. Of the 10 most prominent writers on the issue of fatherhood, 9 of them were women. Now, it could be that male writers were just not writing about fatherhood, but that would probably be an unusual argument. It just seemed very interesting to me that 9 of the most prominent writers writing about fatherhood were in fact not fathers, but they were women. And so the question would have to be raised, are we seeing a one-sided view or a biased view? Certainly, if 9 of the top writers on women's issues were men, I think you'd have to admit there would be somewhat of an outcry. My conclusion in the book that I reached after looking at 2,000 media articles, there was about 9 months of analysis in this. I concluded that men are widely demonized, marginalized, trivialized, and objectified in mass media. I did get some criticism for making that claim. And it was sometimes interpreted as being anti-feminist. And I strongly argued then and continue to argue that in no way is it anti-feminist. It was merely a statement about how media were representing and reporting on men. And the interesting thing is that the methodology I applied and the theoretical framework that I applied in this research was in fact based on feminist research. I found the feminist approach very, very useful. And when you're looking for a theoretical framework, such as why is this important, women had argued for decades, and I agree, that media were instrumental in projecting images of women that became popular and were reinforced in society. So I used exactly a feminist framework to argue that if media and the way we portray women needs to be balanced, then it would also have to hold that the way we portray men should be also balanced. So what might all this mean? Why does a wonderful question in research is so what? I found these are some of the findings that I've run through quickly. We do have to be careful in assuming media effects. For many, many decades, there's been a view that what's in the media shapes public opinion. And that is not always true. So injection or transmissional models of media have been discarded. Audiences are not passive receivers of media messages. In fact, we've seen in the last decade or so, many people trust in media declining, many people saying they do not believe what is in the media. What we do know is a range of audience factors determine effects, their education level, culture, religion, beliefs, and so forth, and that many media messages are rejected or have limited effects. However, media do have some significant effects. And in particular, what we find in media research is that when they're isolated stories, often have no effect. But when a dominant discourse emerges, when there is a consistency in reporting, when that's propagated over time, it does tend to shape public opinion and public attitudes. And that's why we looked at such a large sample. That's why we looked at it over a period of time. And by the way, we looked at this in 5 countries. So it was US, UK, Europe, Australia, and some parts of Asia. So it was quite a large sample that you could say would shape to some extent public opinion and public attitudes. To me, some of the implications is that kind of media reporting gives boys who are growing up little by way of positive role models in public discourse. Now, of course, we would hope that they would have positive role models in the physical world, in their life, but we also know that boys and girls spend a lot of time with media. And I'll come on to social media in a moment, because this was looking at press, radio, and TV. But certainly in the media, when you went to media, there was very little by way of positive role models, unless you looked at fields such as sport, for example, which was one of the few areas where it was positive. Interestingly, also, some people tried to say, well, this is just an issue for men to be concerned about. I actually found a lot of support when I released the research coming from women, particularly women who are the mothers of boys. Many women have sons. And the women who had sons were very, very concerned about their son growing up in a world where there seemed to be these endless negative images of men. And of course, many women have male partners as well, and some were concerned about those male partners. So it's interesting that to a large extent, this is not a single gender issue. This is an issue for men, women, boys, and girls. The impact on men, it's only fair, we must acknowledge that some men are doing very, very well in the world. We still have systems where patriarchy is evident. Men still earn more money than women in many circumstances. So in no way did I want this research, or do I want this research to be seen as poor men, poor men. What it says, though, is that some men are vulnerable and struggling to find a valued identity, particularly in the case of men who are poor, divorced men who have lost access to their children, unemployed men, and in many countries, Indigenous men. And so it's not a generalization. And indeed, feminist literature, again, is quite good at pointing out the importance of the word some. Some women do very, very well, but some women are not doing very, very well in the world. And certainly, I think it is still the case that some men are struggling and very vulnerable in our world. It also, I believe, this constant barrage of media images is likely to affect women's attitude towards men. And that I haven't followed up on research that, but that could be an issue. And certainly we concluded in the research that it has some impact in society generally, not just on people, but the dominant discourses do influence social and political policies and even legislation. And so as we know that politicians and governments respond to what they perceive as public opinion, I've spent a lot of my life working in government communication and in political work. And what I see is that they every day read the newspapers and watch TV, and populism is rampant, and politicians and policymakers do want to, they are influenced by what they see in the media. So it isn't just shaping individuals in our society. This kind of media reporting can also shape policies, areas like child custody laws, what we see in violence against women campaigns. Those are very important campaigns, but one has to ask the question, what about violence against men? And what about violence against women who execute violence on women? Most of the time, almost all of it that I have seen, the coverage is talking about violence that is attributed to men and by men. What we've seen more recently, and I'm coming now towards the present time, the influence of traditional media has declined quite significantly. We see around the world that the circulations, the audiences of traditional media, particularly press, and sometimes TV, has declined. So the number of people following media has declined, trust in media has declined. But at the same time, we've seen an enormous shift in discourse from traditional media to social media. And I've only done preliminary work in this area, but in social media, men as violent sexual abusers continues to be extremely prominent. In fact, in the last 6 months in Australia, where I am based, male violence against women has been extremely prominent in social media, largely because of some of you may have traveled internationally, but we had a case of a woman being raped in our national parliament house, which is quite an astounding thing to happen. And that set off an enormous list of complaints similar to that. And so social media was dominated by this, what they call the hidden problem of male violence and particularly male rape and sexual abuse. The other side of it is that men's health continues to be highly problematic. In countries vary, but certainly in many Western countries, and particularly in poorer countries, men have a shorter life expectancy than women still. There are higher rates of depression. And I looked at figures in 7 major countries where the male suicide rate was 3 times the female suicide rate. And so these are very concerning issues that if we look at men, and I'm acknowledging that many men do very, very well in the world, but equally we have these very, very strong statistics that say you cannot generalize that everything in the male world is fine and okay. There are some significant issues that clearly require address. If we look ahead, I feel that there is no question that men have to change. And continue to change. I think they are changing. I'm of a generation where I grew up where masculinity did have a particular style to it, and behavior that was considered masculine is no longer acceptable. There is also still unacceptable aspects of patriarchy through many of our developed societies. As I said, male health is still seen as largely self-determined. So we seem to be still talking about male health as a problem, but saying it's because men are smoking or drinking too much, and particularly the issue of inattention, men not taking care of themselves. I work a lot in health communication, and what we see in many areas of health communication, whereas it was looked at very much in a clinical sense in the past, looking for cures, looking for clinical methods, what we're increasingly recognizing is that the social is very, very important. The social environment is what shapes and causes a lot of health problems, but also the methods of addressing a lot of health problems, social networks and support are very, very important. A lovely phrase from a health clinician that I heard recently was that people are the best medicine. And we're finding this, whether it's people quitting smoking or encouraging men to get cancer tests or whatever. We find that peer support, social networks is a very, very important part of it. And we've done better in society at providing social support and social networks for women than we have with men. And I guess this organization today is an example of providing resources, but also that peer support. And it is important for men and women to find valued identities and roles. Men over in the course of 2 generations have come from roles, clear roles as breadwinners, as strong, as heroes, as soldiers, into an era where women are just as much breadwinners and also soldiers and many other things. And so where is the uniqueness? Where is the role, the unique opportunities for men? Do indeed they need unique opportunities, but at least they need to find value in their role in society. The final message I wanted to emphasize again, though, is to advance men and male interest in society, which I do believe is important. We can't approach that from an anti-feminist perspective. When I first published my report, this research, I was somewhat concerned that it was grabbed by some quite militant groups and interpreted as an attack on feminism and to try and wipe away feminist claims and say these male issues should be on the agenda. I don't believe militant approaches are appropriate. In all of my work, I appeal for moderation and social inclusion. And inclusion is a critical word. We need to advance women and we need to advance men. We need to advance girls and to advance boys in society. So I've given you a quick overview of the research. I think it's best to go into discussion and questions and answers if you wish. I'm going to stop screen sharing and I'll appear back on camera.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Jim. So indeed, let's go to questions. I'll ask you to please raise your hand, which is a function you should be able to do looking at the drop-down menu by your name. And anybody who doesn't feel comfortable asking in that way can use the chat feature and I can ask the question. So I see Harry Joyce with the first question. So I'm going to allow Harry to talk. Let's hear what he has to say. Go ahead, Harry.
Hello, thank you very much. Harry Joyce in Ottawa. Can you hear me?
I can, Harry.
Hey, thank you very much for a great talk. I do actually have 2 questions, really. Do you think the situation is getting worse? Is one question, and if I may peg on another question, which has both fascinated me and annoyed me recently. There are some news media who, setting aside the actual content, they proceed to basically not include men in the programming. The CBC is quite good at this, in my opinion. The CBC, that's the CBC radio in Canada, is really quite good at not including men in many of their programs until they become largely women-dominated expeditions. I wonder whether, is it fair to ask you both those questions? Is it getting worse? And did you look at the media's ability to just not include men in their programming? Thanks.
Good questions, Harry. In terms of better or for worse, I think we can no longer generalize to say media coverage is better or worse. What I'm seeing from the current situation is some areas there is more attention to negative men's issues, and I'd put domestic violence up there. Not in every country, but certainly in some of the major countries around the world. Domestic violence and violence in society generally is about 80 to 90% linked to men. But actually the statistics do not bear that out. So that's an area where it's got worse. I do think some areas have got better. There is increasing attention to male health. There has been a recognition of the importance of social support. One of my PhD students has been looking at men attempting to quit smoking and using online social support networks, and finding that they have really provided a huge lot of resources and peer-to-peer support, and that it's being very, very successful, that men just want to talk to another man in the same situation. And those things didn't exist probably 10 or 15 years ago. So I think we are slowly getting better at male health and some of those and support for men, but the areas of violence, I think, are still very problematic. The issue of media portraying women, that's an interesting one, because many of my colleagues and friends are journalists and media producers, and they presented that they're aware of it, and they present it as a very pragmatic issue, and they say we're under severe scrutiny if we have 3 men and only 2 women in a scene or in a report. If we interview and we only interview a couple of men, and so they are going out of their way to avoid that criticism, because there are many very active women's groups who will attack them. And they are bending the other way, and they admit, many of them, that they're going the other way because they won't get criticized. Nobody complains if there are more women in a speakers panel than men. But certainly if you put more men on the speakers, and here in my university, it's quite amazing. Every time we have any sort of a panel, anything at all, we're going through some redundancies because of COVID at the moment, and we've had to have a gender balance that we cannot. It's not based on meritocracy. It's got to be based on gender.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you for that, Harry. Let's go to a chat question, which is, well, 2 questions here from Bob. Can we get a transcript of this with visible graphs? I take the fact that Bob wants a transcript as that he enjoyed the talk very much, so thank you for that, Bob. And the second question is, have you ever noticed and or mentioned that, quote, feminism is a completely sexist title? Those are Bob's questions.
Thanks, Bob. I'm happy to provide a PDF of the slides with all the charts if the organization wants to have that. You will be able to see it on the video, of course, but if you wanted a copy, we could do that. The term feminism, a completely sexist title. It's an interesting title because the term feminine is the opposite of masculine, and feminists mostly criticize the terms feminine and masculine because they are constructed identities. Our sex is male or female. That is our actual gender. And so it is, I'm not sure whether it's sexist, but it seems in many ways to be an inappropriate title, simply because it deals with the feminine, which is the constructed. But some of my women colleagues say that they deliberately intended it that way because they were talking mainly about the constructed identity of women rather than their actual gender. And so you can look at it both ways. If you're interpreting it as they are critical of the construction of their identity as opposed to their gender, it's an appropriate word. But masculinism is very hard to say. So.
Okay, we have another chat question. Actually, let's go to a fellow with his hand up, Christopher. Oh, I gotta allow you to talk, don't I? There we go. Please ask your question.
Okay, can I be heard?
Yes, Christopher.
Okay, there was an interview on TV Ontario, I think 2 nights ago, by a female interviewer of a female author whose book, whose current book is very, very popular, and the woman being interviewed spoke about the de-emphasis of female health in medical literature and medical discourse. I have the impression, actually, that there's a good deal more research going on of female conditions than male conditions recently. Is that so? Is it any longer true that female conditions are dismissed as unimportant? Or would you?
I've certainly not seen any evidence that would suggest that. Any data I have seen suggests that attention to both male and female health has increased, both in terms of funding and research and public discussion. Certainly, I mean, women, breast cancer is one example where over the last decade, there's been a huge increase in research and efforts. I myself have been involved in some of that research in 2 countries where we discovered that white Western women are commonly now having mammograms for early detection of breast cancer. But what we did find is what the English call BAME, Black, Asian, minority ethnic, what some countries called culturally and linguistically diverse populations. So groups such as Arabic women, Greek, Italian, early migrants, we found very, very low rates of mammograms among those groups. And so we didn't know why. And there was some very good social research done that identified that it wasn't medical issues, it was often cultural. It was often superstition, belief systems, religion, privacy concerns, and so forth. So there was a development of a whole set of new campaigns in several countries that is reaching into those minority groups. So very targeted. I can't say much more. I think there is a lot of attention to health of women and men, but some of the male issues are still catching up.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. And thank you for the question, Christopher. We have, Paul Ramses would like to ask a question. Okay, let's get you on. Go ahead, Paul. You should be able to talk now.
Hi there. So more upon the issue of men's health. Here in Toronto, Canada, we have many hospitals, many wonderful hospitals, teaching institutions affiliated with universities. And we have one women's college hospital, which has been here for now at least about 80 to 100 years, which focuses only on women's health. And we don't have a hospital dedicated to men's health. More to the point, most hospitals the employees in hospitals are 80 to perhaps even 90% females. Men are completely underrepresented in the healthcare system. And yet we have no pushback on this, no equality for representation in healthcare.
Yes, Paul, I think that's very true. Certainly, there is recognition that in the staff of hospitals, healthcare workers are primarily women, particularly if you look at nurses, as opposed to doctors. Doctors, there's still, I think, more male doctors, but there is catching up. There's an increasing number of women doctors. But the nursing population around the world is very heavily orientated towards women, has been traditionally seen as a woman's job. And that's been a criticism that feminists have made, is that why is nursing seen as a woman's job? I have a son-in-law who is a male nurse, and it's funny how people refer to him as a male nurse, not as a nurse, that it's considered so unusual. And he says it's changed now. He's now in his 40s, but he said when he first went into nursing, he got a lot of raised eyebrows when he said he was a nurse. So there's been a discrimination against men in that field, or an assumption that it's a woman's job. And that probably goes back to Florence Nightingale times. A lot of governments around the world are very concerned because countries like the UK are losing nurses and midwives at a very rapid rate. They are often not paid as well as they should be. The work is very, very stressful in many cases, particularly in emergency and in maternity. And so there is a real drive on to try and attract more nurses, and the new campaigns are looking for men or women. The idea of a women's hospital, I'd again approach that in a balanced way to say that I have no problem with a women's hospital, but equally there's no reason why we couldn't have a men's hospital. I think the reason we have some dedicated women's hospitals is that, of course, the issue of maternity, where there needs to be special training, special systems for maternity, which is a very large part of the health system. And a women's hospital doesn't deny men access to visit, but it specializes, I guess, and just like there's children's hospitals because of the need for specialization. So I don't have a problem with a women's hospital if it's there to specialize in women's health issues such as maternity. You'd have to think of what is the justification for needing a specialized men's hospital. but maybe it could be, you could argue that it may be staffed with more men, more counselling services related to men. That would be an argument you'd have to make, I guess, to the funders.
Yeah, I'll just say, because I know a little bit about the Women's College Hospital. We do some work with them. They may do maternity health or maternity related health, but they don't deliver babies. So I'm not sure sort of how involved their maternal health department is in that. They focus, I think, more actually on mental health for women. They have a pretty big department. But on the other side, they do absolutely accept male patients. And in fact, we've had a number of referrals, believe it or not, from men to our various programs, including because they treat incoming patients for things like domestic violence that they present to the emergency room there with. So they get men, in fact, presenting with domestic violence, and they refer them to us. So it's a bit on both sides with that. Now, Janie had a question. I'm just trying to find her in the chat here. Janie, I think you're one of these people. So I'm letting a few people talk. I think one of them is Janie. So if one of you is Janie, can you go ahead and ask your question of Jim, please?
Hi.
Found her. Go ahead.
Yeah. How about a new prominence? Was there a particular topic where one gender was more prominent than the other? For example, in the case of printed media, like was there, like, in terms of style?
Justin, I couldn't hear that question very well.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that, Janie. Now, Janie did text her question, so I have it here. I'm going to read it for you, Janie, with apologies, because we're not hearing you all that clearly. But he's asking about new prominence. Sorry, let me just mute a few people here. He was asking about news prominence. Was there a particular scenario or topic where one gender was more prominent than the other? Is that still your question, Janie?
Yes.
Okay.
I think we've talked about that, but the issue of violence is the one that is predominantly associated with men still, even though some of the statistics suggest that there is quite a bit of violence perpetrated by women, both domestic violence and even violence on the street. A lot of countries like the UK are seeing gangs involved in stabbing, with young girls involved very often. So I think it's the issue of violence primarily that is linked to men. In other areas where there used to be a huge bias, such as sport, where male sport was very, very dominant, there's been a big shift in that towards promoting women's sport, both in the media and in terms of sponsorship. And I think that's happening in not all countries, but many countries around the world. So sport is balancing out, but violence is still a male issue, if I could say that.
Very good. Thank you. I don't see any hands up, and I think we've gone through the chat. Oh, okay, there's one.
There's one from Bob.
Okay, we'll take maybe one or two more. So in mental health counseling, he says, I think that the advice should take into account the different reactions people have to men and women. Men's Hospital could explore that. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's a case can be made, and I finished the last answer by saying you'd have to make a case for why you needed a men's hospital. It could be specialization in that there's certain cancers that men suffer from. Certain, male infertility is a very different issue to female infertility. So specialization could be an argument. But also the social. If you're providing counseling services, for example, it's different skills and different approaches are required for dealing with men who often, generally, I think you can say, are more reluctant to come forward, more reluctant to talk. Perhaps that's changing with younger men, but certainly men of my generation didn't go to the doctor until things were quite serious. And so I think that is already happening, where a lot, maybe not in the hospitals, but certainly in the health services, where there's a lot of customization to encourage men and to support men. Yes, I'm seeing a comment there, Iron John.
Yeah, so there's a question about men's spirituality groups. I don't know if this questioner, oh, he does want to ask it. Okay, so I'm going to set that up. Okay, Guy, go ahead.
Yes, I had a question because in the 90s, men's spirituality groups, they were starting to establish, and I had read books like Iron John and Fire in the Belly, and there seemed to be a surgence towards men finding a spiritual path in their masculinity. And there's been this very gradual change where today I'm constantly looking over my back and phrasing my words. I have to be I don't feel very safe to be around women that I don't know very well. And I'd even been using the term, I was going my own way. I just felt I had to find my own path. And then I found that this was even a term that was in use, and MGTOWs are viewed unfavorably. And I don't have any animosity against women or their own path, but I just wonder what has happened. Like, do you feel this will ever change, or will men ever be able to feel safe again?
Yeah, Guy, I think there's a couple of really key words you've used there. It is common among men to find many men, you've said, being very careful, struggling to find a safe space to talk and say things, whether it's just conversation, whether it's telling a joke, you have to second guess yourself and say, is this joke acceptable? And yet women are very free to say anything almost. And I can't deny the latter. I think it's women were extremely constrained. If you go back from Victorian times, there was so little that women had to be polite, and it's almost like the era of children had to be seen and not heard. And women have quite rightly argued that they should be, they're citizens and they should be able to say pretty much what they like within the laws of the land and decency. There has been a focus on men, and you're right, many men are quite nervous and struggling to find a safe space and second guessing themselves. And as you hinted, sometimes going underground, withdrawing. I think it's been explained to me as just a wave in the ocean shifting, that to bring attention to some of the more unacceptable levels of male behavior, that you've got to go to perhaps an extreme. I can only say I would hope that it does balance out and become more equal, because I know even in a university environment, the men have got to be super, super sensitive to what they say, how they act. And to some extent, that term feminine side is not spoken about so much now, but men, all trying to be the cool, inclusive, sexually balanced type of person, whereas women are been liberated and can wear less clothing and swear and do what they like. I see it. I don't know the answer to it. Women who I speak to about it just say it will balance out. It's just been a pushback. Men needed a jolt. But I think, like in any cusp of any generation, probably the generation of men that are aged sort of anywhere between, say, 40s and 70s or 80s have been on that generational shift, and they've probably copped it to some extent. But I do sense, among talking to young men, very young men, they don't see this problem at all. They feel very comfortable, or more comfortable than sort of our generations have. Not sure if that answers your question well, but I think it's a good comment anyway, Guy.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Guy. We appreciate the question. We have a few questions coming in. So, Jim, if you're okay for another 2 or 3, we can cap it there.
Yep, that'll be fine.
3 more. Okay, good. So we'll do what we can to get to the last questions here. And I think the next one was from Ray. Ray, you're up. Go ahead with your question, please.
Hi, hello. My name is Ray. I just wanted to ask, I did a bit of research previously because I had to write an essay for university about this topic. And I brought up a few things. So I wanted to ask, do you believe that shame plays a very big part in the way men interact, not just with each other, but with the dominant culture nowadays? Like, is it like we have more liberties and freedom now, but are men still feeling the pressure to conform to traditional gender roles rather than exploring in any way? Because I've seen people say that if they behave too feminine, they get excluded from a lot of things, and if they behave too masculine, the same thing happens. And being themselves as they need to be, it's considered not a real true blood man. And I was wondering if, like, the shame of having to like not conform to those gender roles would play a role in the development of young boys' masculinity going onward.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. There's almost, I think, two key issues there. Men being able to be themselves, I think, within the bounds of laws and decency, should be a right, because very much women are demanding the right to be themselves, again, within the bounds of law and decency. And that's the whole nature of the fight for independence and social equity, etc. So I do see the issue of shame is a particular issue. And shame is often used intentionally to stop certain behaviors. And men are often shamed in media or in public discussions for doing things. I am opposed to using shame as an intentional strategy, because what follows shame, when you are shamed, usually it's a negative experience and it often harbors resentment. So even though it might stop the behavior that you're being shamed for, the people often hold a resentment, and they comply only to avoid the shame and don't really change their attitudes or behavior. So it becomes this bottled up anger or frustration. So there are some campaigns that try to use shame. There's even been TV advertising campaigns. I've studied one that looked at speeding in cars, and they discovered in the research that it was young males who did most of the speeding and doing wheelies and burnouts on streets. And so they did a campaign that young women were poking fingers and laughing at the men and shaming them. And what they found is that the public all talked about the ad, and it was a very popular ad and won a bunch of awards. But when they did research a year later, they found young men very, very angry and resentful to say, why were they being shamed in this way? When in fact, you know, they were doing something that one of the things that came out of it was even providing circuits for young men to go and drive their cars on, because driving cars is a pleasurable experience for many young people. And so maybe it was society needed to come up with a solution that allowed young men to have fast cars and to enjoy them, and not just simply shame them. So shame, I'm quite opposed to using shame. When shame is caused accidentally, as it often is, where men are feeling shame to be feminine or ashamed to be too masculine, that's a tough gig. I think it's just a matter of finding a balance. I don't regard myself as feminine, but I certainly am not the male I was probably in my early 20s. When I look back on my behavior, I think some of the changes in behavior were justifiable and necessary. And so I hope men can find their way.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Okay, so we're down to 2, and I'm going to ask this one from one of our chat-based questioners. Is there any study or trend as to how government policy or law discriminates, I guess, against fatherhood or parenting, and is it balanced?
That's a controversial question. It varies country to country. In Australia, for example, there's been a decade of very strong criticism of our family court that made it nearly impossible for men to get custody of children. The laws were very heavily biased in a way that even a woman with mental health problems, drug problems, or many other issues would get custody when a father was willing to take custody. I think it has evened out. There's been adjustments to it, but there's still criticism of sort of child custody arrangements in many countries. That's one of the areas that I think government policy has attempted to provide more rights to women, which is necessary, but many people would say many governments have gone too far. in areas like child custody and laws around divorce. On the other hand, the legalization of gay marriage has been an area where governments have responded to public pressure and have legislated in that is a benefit to male and female.
Okay, and our last question, and the questioner was invited to ask it directly but hasn't responded, so I guess I'm going to do that on his behalf, if I can find it now. And this was a question, about entertainment. So he says he was hoping to get a little bit more on, I guess, entertainment media or entertainment news. Do you have any plans to do a study of entertainment media, especially regarding violence between men and women?
The answer is to specifically no. I don't have a plan to do that research. There have been a few studies done of entertainment. In fact, when I did this particular study, there was actually most of the research was on entertainment media, how men and women were portrayed in soap operas and dramas, etc. And there was very little on news media and factual reporting, which I think at the end of the day is a very important area because it's allegedly telling the truth. It'd be interesting to see that research. I suspect that entertainment follows the pattern that some of the other questioners mentioned before, that producers have, I think, gone a little bit overboard in some cases to make sure they've got promoting women actors and scenes that favor women and scenes that represent women in an empowered way. I certainly see a lot of empowerment of women occurring in entertainment media, which is perfectly justifiable. But I did see in my research, it wasn't very prominent, but portrayal of men as stupid and incompetent did come up in my research, even in news media. And I think that's often very common in entertainment media, where you basically, in simple terms, it's no longer acceptable to make fun of women and trivialize women. But if you want to have comedy, which a lot of entertainment involves, you've almost got to pick on somebody. And so most producers now say it's safe to ridicule men because you'll get into trouble if you ridicule women, particularly if the humor is, not clearly, it's more nuanced. So I think there is some, but my focus these days, just because of where priorities lie and universities is sort of in other areas of health communication. I'm actually still leading a global project for the World Health Organization where we're looking at things like misinformation and disinformation. So it's critically important. I wish I could do more. And what you suggest is probably important, but right now I am full up to here with research projects, and certainly looking at COVID and health communication and making it more effective is very, very critical for men, women, boys, and girls.
Well, thanks so much for that, Jim. And knowing you're a busy guy, I'm especially grateful that you found time for us tonight. That means a lot to me, and I think to all of us who are on at the event today. A lot of questions shows a significant amount of engagement on this topic. In fact, the questions are still coming in, but I'm afraid we are going to conclude things there. For those of you who have asked, this event has been live streaming over YouTube, which means that it is also going to stay up on YouTube. So if you missed part of it, or you have people who weren't able to attend who are interested, please send them to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/EqualityCanadaTV. I'll put that in the chat bar. And also already in the chat bar is the links to the next set of webinars in the series. So again, just to reiterate, next up will be on June 17th. That's the Family Health During Relationship Breakdown panel event. That'll be a signature event for us. We're really hoping to see a lot of you there. And then Jeff Segura, that's coming up in July on men as early childhood educators. And then in August, Douglas Todd, his experiences reporting on men in Canada. But for tonight, I really want to thank Jim Macnamara again for joining us and bringing a lot of insight to a fascinating topic. I wish you could hear everybody clapping for you, Jim. You'll just have to hear me, and that'll have to kind of echo through your ears or something, but really appreciate your time tonight. So thanks so much for joining us. And to our audience, thanks for being such an engaging audience. We always appreciate that.
Thank you very much. All the best.
Bye now.